Bob can't talk about his sandcastles anymore. And I know this is kind of weird to make it specific to sandcastles, but it becomes even more real when you talk about things like work and things like school and academic success, where, these things become way, way more important than just sandcastles. This is what I define as toxic masculinity. Me doing this competition thing is preventing me from being good to other men.
But there's never a conversation, I think, of how to actually maybe pick yourself up from the failure when it happens. Validating others doesn't mean that it invalidates you. The more validation and the more appreciation you can provide out into the world, whether that be from men to other men, or men to all others in society, it's not a zero-sum game of that if you provide it out, you will be invalidating yourself. And understand that there's always an opportunity to empower someone, to give someone an opportunity to speak, to allow someone to be heard, that those opportunities can happen more often than they do right now.
Hello, my name is Miguel Almario, and welcome to Speak. This is a show about empowering people in their mental health journey. And if you want to support us, please consider following our club's social media at The I Am Collective. This episode is about men's mental health, expectations, failure, and growth, and I hope you enjoy the show today. So I hope reading week has gone pretty well for you. At the time that you're hearing this episode, we're just about getting ready to go back to class. And, it's been a wild, wild year. And, it kind of dawned on me today that we're, about to approach December and then January. And I was putting down a date for, something to do in January and realized that it was the year 2021. And, this whole shebang has kind of just flown by. But without, kind of delving too much into it, we did kind of overcome a long year. Biden's president now. That's kind of weird. This is totally not part of the episode, but it's insane. It's insane how much has happened in the last little while. So with your family at the I Am Collective, let's finish the semester strong. And oh, there's a doorbell. Okay, Victor, kind of get rid of that. Anyways, yeah, it's good that we have gone through so much, and let's just get ready to finish the semester strong. And as we do every week, we have a very lovely guest here today, and that is my good friend and someone I've been able to learn with for the last year, Richard. So Richard, if you want to just go ahead and introduce yourself.
I love the lovely introduction. Great start to it. Hi, everyone. My name is Richard. I'm a 22-year-old male student at the University of Calgary. Currently in my fifth year of a finance degree. And really in my degree, I was really taking a chance to take on as many leadership opportunities as possible. In terms of director of finance at the Haskayne Consulting Club, which I find very passionate in an area of expertise I want to develop more. And also opportunity to be a founding associate on the UC Haskayne Student Fund, where I get exposed to ventures and new up and coming businesses in Calgary. And I think both of these experiences speak to where I want to be in my career and kind of where I am currently and where I think I offer value of that. I'm at a stage when I'm leaving school and I want to see as many experiences that I can help other students throughout their experience with school and be accessible as possible and hopefully help them achieve their dreams along their goal. So that's hopefully enough to garner the great introduction that I just got from Miguel as well.
No, everything's good for you, Richard. So I had the privilege of meeting Richard a little bit last year, and he's someone that I've kind of looked up to in ways, and I've told him this, prior to us being here, and getting a chance to work with him and work on this episode specifically. There's a lot that we both have to say about men's mental health, and being guys and being a huge mental health advocate. There is something that we have in terms of a role to other people, and it's something that I've talked about in other episodes where we have to give back, and it's just good for us. It's good for people who would need this sort of support and need this sort of guidance. So in a very broad sense, we're going to be talking about men's mental health as a whole, themes and areas that we both recognize and identify with heavily. And Richard has something kind of cool brewing in the background, and he has a concept called destination theory, which we'll kind of go into right off the bat here. But as a whole, we will be talking primarily about expectations, the idea of failure, and the idea of growth. Where can you go after first making expectations, whether you meet them or you're not, the times where you do fail, because it will happen. And how can we as a people kind of go forward? So first things first, the idea of expectations and the male experience of expectations. Now, this is something that Richard and I, kind of can echo, as students, as business students, that there's this idea for men that they are expected to provide and are providers. So that's something that you can't really deny at this day and age. And even looking back into history, society has always put men in this position of providership, and whether that is through leadership roles or in breadwinning, despite whatever moral implications that might have, it is something that men have to kind of deal with. And in terms of expectations, and this might be a good time to introduce the destination theory, but Richard, how have you seen expectations? And this is kind of a weird question, but how have you kind of interacted with them, and what has your relationship been with the idea of expectations?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start in terms of expectations. As a male, I think you get put into a box if there's certain areas that you have to contribute in or certain areas that you have to provide significant value in, and that determines your value as a person. Like you mentioned, breadwinning is one of them in the context of a relationship where your value is often determined on how much you can provide on a monetary value. Um, Excluding all other factors, and I think that zoned in version of thinking is very destructive and can be a negative on males insights, because they lack the purpose or the idea that they have to develop these other areas, and two, if that area of breadwinning or whatever area they think they provide the most value is taken away from them, there may be this feeling that they can't provide in other areas, and that kind of leads to more larger issues of where they want to escape situations where that could be present. So I think those are the exposures that I've had recently. And then in terms of leadership too, that not everyone leads in the same way, but sometimes we have a predefined thinking of what leadership should look like, especially from a man's perspective. Um, and not everyone fits into that box. So I think it's the idea that there's no right way, and these expectations need to be broken down into that. You can provide value in many different areas. It doesn't have to be the societal ones that are commonly expected of males, but that's the interaction I've had with them so far.
Hmm. And I think it's something that you just touched on, where we you can kind of see it in the way that we teach men about manliness, and it's tied directly to the idea of providing and the idea of breadwinning and leadership. And it even goes back to think about elementary school, with the way that uh you know boys and girls are taught differently, and whether that is for a good reason or a bad reason, it is something that you know the idea of providing and having that tied so deeply to our ego and accomplishments, and the way that we growing up, kids flaunt things without really knowing how that kind of attitude has a lasting impact and can affect the way that you know young men see themselves, and carrying that forward as an adult, it leads you to tie accomplishments and visible signs of pride so directly to your self-perception. And that becomes my definition of toxic masculinity. But I think we can kind of go into that a bit more later. But it's this weird idea that gets cultivated even as kids, where everything is a contest. And for that reason, when men get older, you reach this point where you know we're scared to share accomplishments with one another, because we haven't really cultivated this uh, community, or this air of communal improvement, where one of us does well, then we all do well. It's always this idea that you know well, Bob is doing really good at this one thing, and every time I talk to Bob, he just keeps talking about how he is really good at building sandcastles. And that was our little analogy that me and Richard kind of used throughout our scripting process. But Bob comes in and he's really good at making sandcastles, and every time we talk to Bob, he just brings up his sandcastles. And you know there's nothing inherently wrong about talking about things that make you proud, and things that you've accomplished, and things that you can stand by, and recognize your own successes in a way. But for men and in groups where everyone is kind of competing in this weird, unspoken, but very much so tangible competition that, Bob can't talk about his sandcastles anymore. And I know this is kind of weird to make it specific to sandcastles, but it becomes even more real when you talk about things like work and things like school and academic success, where, these things become way, way more important than just sandcastles. And, along that same line, that kind of builds an underlying resentment with groups of guys specifically, where, we can't celebrate each other's success and we can't celebrate who we are. And, you know, I think I want to go back on this idea of resentment. And so, Richard, when we talk about this idea of like this competition that goes on with guys all the time, you know, what is that role in what does that play into when it comes to the idea of resentment and how it's built over time?
Yeah, 100%. I think that idea of, you brought up the sandcastles and the comparison idea, is that when you do something great, I think there's this, from your inner workings, you want to be able to share that work with the people you care about, share the work with the people around you, and not in a way of comparison or to say that it's maybe better than what they're doing or more robust or even trying to move yourself up the social ladder. It's more so it's just you are grateful of the effort you put in. You're excited to share something, um, and sometimes that's taken as you're trying to create that comparison when I don't think it's there. And that underlying resentment, kind of, I've noticed it in my own personal life in some occasions of where you're genuinely trying to share something you're excited about, but instead of receiving excitement, I think you receive the opposite end of that person maybe believing that they're not doing as much, so they can't be excited for you because they're not necessarily excited about what they have going on for whatever's going on in their life, their own sandcastle, right? So I think there's this underlying factor. There's not an emphasis on let's build each other up, but it's more of let's see where you are. Oh, I'm not there yet. I'll celebrate when I get to that stage or when I can celebrate with you. And I think that's a little bit dangerous because you're trying to create a position where everyone can celebrate their own factors. You can share a common safe spot where you can share your achievement. Um, I want to hear about what you're doing. You can hear about what I'm doing, and we can build each other up. And maybe I'm building a sandcastle, maybe you're building your car. And there's two different things. Those are two different worlds, but they're not to be compared. They're just to be kind of idled at, odd at, from each different perspective. And that's kind of, I think, where we want to take it. But right now, there's that idea of resentment where you're looking at someone and saying, man, I could do that, or I wish I could do that. And because of that, I don't really want to celebrate them until I can celebrate my own success in that area.
And it, I think we're both kind of hammering at this idea of like the comparison that happens in the first place, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a comparison, but it's just that we when we see people in our groups that are achieving things that we wish we could do, and whatnot, it forces us to reflect on what are we doing, what's preventing us from doing these things. And you know by doing so, by entering this kind of frame of mind, you are quite literally undermining yourself as you go about this thought process. And it it doesn't matter if you're again, sandcastle god, if you're just really good at building these things, or if you're Elon Musk with Tesla and you can you know build electric cars and whatnot. Like, the degrees in which success happens and success manifests, and what can and you can't feel pride for, these are different on a case by case basis, and there's different circumstances that go behind everything. And you know at the end of the day, we all deserve to be proud of something. And I think that this being a competition for a lot of guys and a lot of males growing up, that we don't exactly understand the effort that we put in, and understand how much that means to us on a case by case basis. And so this is predominantly a male experience. This happens for women as well, but I think this weird competition phase that all guys are in perpetually, uh, society feels that. And in a weird way, that prevents men from being vulnerable, and that prevents men from uh, ever really having that sense of unity with other men, because everything ends up being a weird kind of composition. And this is what I kind of have I hinted at earlier, but this is what I define as toxic masculinity. is that idea of uh me being a man and me doing this competition thing is preventing me from being good to other men. And now we have created walls where walls didn't exist before, and it's kind of our own doing. And in ways it's in part because no one teaches us how to be men and how to deal with expectations. So it's a weird it's a weird dynamic purely from the expectation standpoint. And I know that Richard has a bit to talk about in terms of this toxic masculinity bit. So, based on that kind of realm of it and the competition and the pride, how it affects other people, Richard, what do you have to say about this definition of toxic masculinity?
Yeah, I think the toxic masculinity area, you did a great job of explaining it. And then this idea that coming back to that everything is a comparison, but we've zoned down these specific comparisons in terms of what you do for work or how much money you make. These quantifiable factors that easily allows you to make a comparison, but where there's areas of less comparison, we won't put as much emphasis. And where I'm going with this is, you could be a great person at communicating. You can have a great access to vulnerability, accessing your emotions, or speaking with other men, speaking with all types of people, and that could be a skill that you really lead and you pride yourself on. But society doesn't necessarily value that or validate you for that. Instead, they'll go back to those same factors that are commonly compared to, like salary. And I think that is what creates toxic masculinity, because you may be a leading candidate in one of those areas, but you're not observant of all of these other areas that you may fall short in. And those softer skills, those maybe ones that are more difficult to compare, are the skill set that make you a better person, more so than a better man too. And I think that that idea is a little concerning with toxic masculinity, that you only compare these great features that you can quantify, when sometimes the most important things are um, those other softer skills that you need. And in the context of your groups of friends, I think those are the types of conversations that you have. How do you improve yourself in areas of like communication, areas of creating a comfortable space for others to speak their mind? Um, that breaks down those barriers aforementioned in toxic masculinity and allows people to really show their other skill sets shine. And I think encourages more conversation overall.
Yeah. And like, if we think about, carrying these biases forward, these are, these frameworks, these little bits of attitude that we have towards, each other, men on men, whatever. These are things that you kind of end up embedding onto kids. And I think this is how we see this issue now of, uh, mental health being such a prominent thing in today's world. Now that we can identify it, we should be doing something about it. And this is kind of a goal. But kind of speaking more onto the idea of expectations, like at the end of the day, after everything that we've kind of delved into, what ends up happening is it really skews your individual perception of yourself, of other people, and what you consider success and failure. And the perception of these qualities and these happenstances in your life, that is key to understanding your mental health fundamentally. So kind of going into our next topic, which is the idea of failure. And just to start us off, it is in the same respect that men aren't taught to understand these expectations, and they're kind of just thrust upon you after you reach a certain age. In that same token, men aren't really taught how to fail. And this specifically isn't uh, you know mutually exclusive. Women for the most part aren't taught how to fail either. But uh, for the most part, the the big problem here is that failure becomes so tied to the expectations we talked about earlier that you know men feel it almost perpetually when they look at other people, when they look at other men. And no one is teaching young boys how to understand failure. No one is teaching them how to react to it. And the kind of baseline advice that most people get is, it's normal to make mistakes, it's normal to fail, and you should learn from it. But we're not taught how to deal with that feeling of inadequacy. And we're not taught how to react when things like this do happen. We're just expected to learn right away. And of course it's important to learn from your mistakes, don't get me wrong, that's what you're supposed to be doing. But it's interesting when we see that this is an attitude that hasn't exactly improved over, the course that we've been a very highly sophisticated society. So, speaking of that and how failure is tied so deeply into our validity as men, Richard, what do you have to say about, this dynamic that we are constantly playing with? And, you know, how does failure kind of surface for you? And what is your, uh, you know, idea behind this relationship with men and failure?
Yeah, speaking candidly, I think I have a tremendous fear of failure. And that's something difficult to admit, but I think that's something that's shared among all types of people. But it specifically resonates in me in that I don't think I've learned exactly, even at this point in my life, of how to address those feelings properly when something doesn't go the way you expected it, and how to rebound. And like you said, there's learning pieces, and each time it happens, I think you kind of work your way forward. But there's never a conversation, I think, of how to actually maybe pick yourself up from the failure when it happens, what you're gonna feel, and maybe like a guided pathway of how it's gonna happen. And it does happen differently for different people based on the different expectations you're reaching for. But I think at each time there's a fear that maybe sometimes would prevent you from trying new things, trying to get out of your comfort zone, and trying to maybe be more than you can. And yeah, that current experience, that fear of failure sometimes is crippling. It doesn't want it speaks to you, and that you don't want to go out of the things that you know, and that's not for somewhere to grow. And even in the larger context of failure, then how do you experience that failure? Are you okay with sharing it when it happens, or do you kind of try to hide it, sweep it under the rug, and make sure no one knows that you're experiencing it? So I think my place with failure so far, to my point in my life, and historically how I've tried to deal with is, hey, if no one sees it, maybe they don't know that it happened. When I'd love to see the transition happen to, hey, this is how I failed, this is why I failed. Let me share it, and that way we can break it down, understand it together, and maybe someone else who goes through that similar failure doesn't have to experience the same lows as you went through, right? And I think that conversation can start earlier. And like you said, that people aren't usually taught how to fail; they're just taught what to do way later down the line. And I think there is a better way to fail, I guess.
Yeah, and I feel like, you hear it academically too about how failure is a very good thing. And for the most part, when we talk about those kinds of failures and we learn from, role models, people, uh important members of society, and we try and take pieces away of from their stories, or you know how we should be looking at failure. And in all these examples, these people have already crossed the bridge. They've already taken the lessons away that they needed to, and now they're talking about, their hardship. This is a difficult time for me, and look at what was made. And there's a lot of emphasis on the endpoint and the results from these failures. And I feel like we kind of do a disservice to the process in between, where people have to understand failure first and have to recognize and reconcile that idea of not meeting the expectations they might have sought out earlier. And that idea of coming to grips with the fact that you have, disappointed yourself or disappointed people around you. These are things that aren't taught to people, but should be taught to people and should be taught to young men and boys. And then it kind of marries pretty poorly with the inability for men to be vulnerable, because if you look at how that dynamic kind of plays into it, where men try maybe extend their comfort zone a little bit to be vulnerable with people, and have their emotions on display a bit more, and then they fail. Either the girl doesn't reciprocate you, or the people in your life that you deem important don't reciprocate the way that you feel, and now your failure in this instance, and this failure being tied so specifically to attempting vulnerability. Now, how do you observe your feelings? How do you, as a man, look at the way that you've conducted yourself and realize that, wait a minute, I failed this. I expected people to react a certain way, and now they're not. Well, does that mean I can't show myself to anyone? Does that mean I can't, open my heart up to other people? And now you reach this, you understand that men aren't vulnerable because no one's teaching them, and every time they try, they have tied this so deeply to their ego that when they fail, now they go into desperation mode. They never want to try it again. And for a lot of dudes, they kind of just hold on to that, and that's how they exist perpetually. So the reaction here is what we can kind of understand as the problem. Like, no one's taught how to react to these things and react to these feelings, and they're among the most normal things you can go through. But we still don't know how to teach that. We still don't know how to, you know, implore good principles and good emotional strategies to our young men. And you feel that, especially, you know, being an immigrant. And this is something I've talked about beforehand on other episodes, but you kind of have to play this tightrope pretty tightly. And it's unfortunate that this is the circumstance that you find a lot of men in. And it's difficult, but you know this mindset prevents us from taking lessons away inevitably from failure. And Richard, I've kind of been, that was a whole tangent, but the going back to how mindset can affect your relationship with failure. I kind of want to ask, in the times that you failed and have actually been able to take something away from it, how what is the role that mindset has played for you in these instances?
Yeah, I'll start with that question of how I think I used to deal with failure originally, and a lot of it stems from sports too. Of when I fail at a sport, lose a game, have a tough practice, something like that, you feel like you're isolated or that you need to deal with it on your own. That you need to go back to the drawing board, and there's only one way to fix it, and that's it. It's something's wrong with you, right? And that I think that does a tremendous amount for you in terms of you can develop yourself or you can get better. But I think there's an understanding or a key understanding that was missed in that is that it's not a you only thing. That you can employ help, you can ask for ways to get better, and it might advance you even faster than if you think you can only isolate and do it on your own. And I think that historically was the way that I tried to deal with failure of, let me go figure this out. I don't want to talk to anyone. I can come back. I can do this. And it was like I needed to prove it to myself. And I think now my dealings with failure is more so, well, if I'm experiencing failure, I'm experiencing difficulty, if I'm willing to share it, there might be someone else that has gone through something similar that had a very successful approach that they used to improve themselves and make them better than they were because, or make them better than the situation that caused them failure. And I think that is what I'm trying to learn and employ more in my current life is that failure, yes, can mean you fell short in an area, but failure is an opportunity for growth if you're willing to reach out and ask for that assistance in that recovery mode. And now in the context of sports in school, especially, if you're not understanding an idea, it's not, I need to go figure this out on my own. It's who knows or who's maybe been through my situation, what caused them to go through it, and hopefully they're willing to share and maybe I can learn something from them. But you got to be willing. The start of that is be willing to open up and say, hey, I did fail. Like you said, share that and accept it. And then from that moment, I think you can make the most tremendous growth leaps once you're able to open up the conversation and understand you're starting from a place of failure. Um, but that's been my experience and my growth trajectory I've tried to develop, I guess, with failure. And the biggest takeaway is understanding that while failure in itself, the action can be done by one person, I think the recovery from failure is where you want to include the people that you care about most and include those people going forward. And you touched on one other thing is that what happens when you fail and then maybe you don't get the response that you're expecting from the people around you, or maybe you felt like you were in a safe space but you weren't so much exposed to that right away. Do you close off yourself to all of those future interactions? um, and speaking from experience, I think I've been in that situation too where maybe you communicate expectations, you open up about failure and you don't get the response or the help or the assistance that you need. I think in those situations it's very difficult, but you got to understand that you need to understand, I think, what areas do you need help with that failure. And if you can come to terms with the acceptance and start with that, opening up these conversations to people that relate to you will make it easier than people that maybe don't understand the magnitude of your failure. So I think starting from a place of someone that can relate would be great with that to move forward with it. But that's been my experience today.
Hmm. And it's like that weird adage that you hear all the time. You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take, and you hear it in so many different circumstances and so many different contexts. But when we approach failure and when we approach the idea of growth, I think that one piece that's missing from a lot of people when kind of observing this relationship is that it really just takes practice, and it really takes you putting that effort of you putting yourself out there in the first place. Like, if we're going with some tangible real life examples here. So uh going back to who I was before university, back in like high school, grade school, whatnot, I'm not naturally a very extroverted person. And as I have conversations with people and you get to know me, it's something that I make very apparent that I'm very loud. That's something I was born with. I have a very loud voice, and it, for the most part, takes up a room. I've kind of figured that out. I'm a loud individual, but it's kind of this weird irony because I'm not very prone to you know taking that step and trying to be in front of people. I think it kind of freaks me out. I get like genuine terrifying anxiety from it. But the I've kind of fell in love with the idea of helping people and fell in love with the idea of being in front of people and trying to uh, affect people's lives. And in order to do that, you kind of need to be able to step out of your comfort zone. So when I observe my own process of coming about that and reaching this point where I can approach people I don't know or speak in front of crowds and whatnot. That was a process of, you know, practice. And it's really like you got to take every little inch that life gives you. And it didn't turn out well the first time. It's probably not going to turn out well the second time. You're probably going to build a shit sandcastle one of these times. But you get better at it. And whether you acknowledge it, whether your friends acknowledge it, whether the expectation is that you get good tomorrow or you get good in the future, whatever it is, every time you try and every time you consciously put effort into it, you do get a little bit better. And I think that as men, that crucial bit of learning that, that everything is incremental, you learn it in doing things. You learn it in like through sport, through work, you learn it by actually doing it. But it's sad that we're not taught this more like earlier so that you know when kids end up having to experience it, a lot of them kind of shut down, and that just translates to how you end up growing up. And it's difficult seeing people who never really end up learning these things or learn them late or whatever. And not saying that you can't, it's always a good time to learn how to rebound and learn how to open yourself up to these practices, opening yourself up to being uncomfortable. But, I wish that this is something that we as a society can grow and hopefully provide to more people. And kind of moving us into our last topic is, the idea of growth. And, we touched a little bit on it previously, but this is more so in the lens of, as a man today who has gone through these things, how do we get better? How can we make this better for other men? And I'm gonna Richard, let's start us off. Like how can we make this better for other men?
I'm going to start with a quick story on the last one about Miguel. I actually didn't tell him I was going to go into this one, but a surprise for him too. I can see him smiling. We were both part of a club, JDC West. And in our last year, I was on one of the academic teams, and Miguel was on the social team. And he spoke about his crippling anxiety, or maybe it's difficult to speak in public. But I remember, I believe I was a mentor on one of his first, or one of the presentations that their team had to give near the end of the year. And seeing him present and seeing him provide the perspective that he did on the case that they completed with very little to no prior practice, I wouldn't have even known that he had um, that that approach to speaking in public or maybe connecting with people because he was such a natural. But I think in the feedback session, I think the three of his teammates were like, we expected to get absolutely ripped apart. We thought we failed. And what we did as mentors was tell them the truth of, it wasn't a comparison of, oh, we would have done this, we would have done that, we would have done this. Yes, you did fail. It was literally us watching it take place. And it was incredible to see them present and then see them think that they failed when in actuality they did an amazing job. So just leading off that idea of growth and failure, that his ability to share that maybe insecurity, if you may, about that speaking in public, but then having us confirm that it was actually a strength of his, I think is the empowerment and the growth of where you can start. And that when people do a great job and people address these concerns, or people share their emotions, and people address these insecurities of both failure, expectations, all of this, especially as men towards each other, is that those are the best opportunities to really boost someone up and remind them that they can, even if they believe it's a weakness right now, that it's an opportunity for growth and they're on the right track. And I think that's the piece that sometimes we miss, that we try to give so much critical feedback that sometimes all you need is encouragement to go forward and that you're on the right course. So on the topic of failure, on the topic of expectations, shout out Miguel for truly living the dream. I just wanted to bring that up as a observant mode of, you can develop these areas that, and I think it's about being positive in the reaction and understanding the sensitivity of the situation as well.
Well, I didn't expect Richard to kind of go into it, but I appreciate that. I appreciate that as a, someone who, I know Richard. Like I said, I looked up to Richard for, better part of a year now, and it means a lot to hear something like that. So thank you so much. But what Richard said there was really important is the idea of validity. And when we approach any situation and we see someone invest themselves emotionally into, whether it's, academics, whether it's through clubs, whether it's through Sandcastles, because we love those apparently this episode, whether you put yourself into anything, we, as people who are mentors, as people who are leaders, as, even being just a bystander and watching someone go through something difficult, you should be prepared to make them feel valid. And our goal should be allowing people to feel valid in whatever it is they feel. And whether it is, meeting their expectations, whether it's led to a failure, whether no matter the circumstance, that kind of informing people that their emotions are valid, their experiences are valid, that will just lead us to a better place, I think. And I think Richard can also echo that as well. And he also brought up a very good point about sort of that the role that mentors play in this, the role that leaders play in this. So how can, and this is a question back to you, Richard, in terms of opening doors and conducting these forms of examples and leadership and mentorship, how else can we sort of open doors for people?
That is a great question. I'll start in this one area of that. More generally speaking, I think people need to be more comfortable in sharing not only their accomplishments, but their failures. And why I say this is I'll zoom in on LinkedIn as an example, but LinkedIn's a great place where you can share all of the accomplishments, share what you've done, share your experience. But if you look at someone's LinkedIn, you might consider, or maybe even one of ours, you might consider that they're a success by normal convention of the word. But you have no idea of any other personal characteristics that they carry on behind the accomplishments, or maybe the tasks that they've completed, versus openly sharing, hey, I applied to this and I failed because of this. I think I fell short in these areas and I'd love to develop these more. That gives you a more human, realistic, and relatable experience with the people that you're communicating with. And in this larger context of, you said, how can we actually make this reality, or what tangible things can we do beyond mentorship? I think just giving opportunities for people to jump into conversations that they can relate to. Maybe not everyone can relate to success at this point in their careers or as they're developing, especially as younger kids, as you mentioned. But I think more people can relate to failing in comparison or not living up to expectations than they can relate to actually meeting expectations. So while people don't usually want to broadcast that they fell short in some areas, I think those are the type of conversations you want to make more commonplace, because I think more people will be able to relate to that, myself included. I think I'm a great example. I need to share more of those and have those discussions and talk with people, because I think that's where you actually find common ground. And I think that's the kind of launch board of where you want to see this come from.
That was beautifully said. I think that we do need to have these, instances of our own failures, especially from people that we look up to, just to be more vocal about them. And you know, there's always something we can learn from each other. And I think that, creating those opportunities so people can build those relationships and meet people who have been in their similar position, or if you are someone who has gone through difficulty, or have has dealt with this degree of, I haven't exactly amounted in these areas how I wanted to. And if you have learned from that and learned how to sort of, grit your teeth, pull yourself out of the mud, so to say, then you are in a very perfect position to help other people. And I think that, you know as this becomes more and more prevalent, as people become more and more comfortable sort of, engaging in vulnerable conversation, that this is how you can continue having conversations like this and opening up these opportunities for other men, whether it be people whether it be people you don't know, whether it's people you've known since third grade, and kind of branching off that, like, in even with our own friend groups, like, Richard, how do you kind of promote this sort of healthy growth within a group setting, especially with people that you might have history with, or in one sense or another? I know this is a loaded question, but how can we both, go out and with the people that we hold really close, how do we kind of promote this healthy growth?
I think one area that we touched on in a previous conversation was the idea of when you have friends that maybe not following the same career path, maybe not the same education path, um, things of those sense that other people on the outside would see as not equating. Maybe that you're further ahead in life than them, which I don't think is true at all, because they have these developed areas of their own life that are far ahead what those measurement tools can kind of measure and establish. But that being said, I think those kind of conversations with people that are you're perceived to be ahead of, you have to be willing to acknowledge it, and kind of reach back and create opportunities for them to come into the conversation. You got to be the one that takes on the responsibility of opening the dialogue, of saying, how are you doing? As simple as that. How do we break down this? And how do we not let what societal, these outer pressures affect our relationship by insulating it, by speaking to each other first before those outside forces can get in? And then specifically within my friend groups, I think I've noticed that being one of my initial close friends group that I've grown up with since elementary, since middle school, very tight knit. Um, and it has nothing. And just because some of us went to university and some of us didn't, the conversations that we have nothing to do with that sometimes, and it's more about who we are, where we are growing up, um, and kind of the people that we want to be more so than the compliments that we want to take. But I think maintaining those conversations and understanding that while society perceives you as maybe further ahead, that you can never basically just leave it off, but how do you come back to it and still connect on the certain areas that you have in common? I think that doesn't allow you to get disconnected from who you are before you achieved any type of success or working success, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And, like, kind of touching on that as well, like, we've talked about how these expectations, the conventional ones, the leadership, the breadwinning, the providing, these are arbitrary, and these are metrics that exist outside you. And these are metrics that, when you have close groups and people that you trust and have vulnerability with, these are people that don't abide by that kind of standard here. If we're operating as friends, we're operating as friends. And it's difficult sometimes to remember that, when you're outside, when you're in the world, yeah, you're being compared to everyone else, and that's what it is, unfortunately. But when you come in here, and when you're with your peers and you're with people that care about you and love you, that, you know no one is looking at how much is in your bank account right now, or no one is looking at, you know do you have the next 10 years figured out. When when you're with people that care about you, and when you're with people that love you, they just want to know that you're doing okay, and they just want to know that you are achieving what you want to achieve. You're learning from what you're and this is something I've said beforehand, but as friends and as people that care about other people, I think that we all have this role to our friends to hold them to the standards that they set for themselves.
Hmm.
And it's something that, it sounds pretty straightforward. It sounds pretty easy when, you're speaking about it from a third person, but it's different when you're in front of your friends, and it's different when you're in front of your peers, that you you understand the people that they are more than anyone else. And you're not there to, you know, compare them to Bill Gates or the number one sandcastle builder in the world. You're there to love them, and you just want whatever they want for themselves. And if you see things that are contrary to this belief, then of course you're going to hold them accountable to it. But it's important that, in this relationship too, that everyone feels valid in the way that they see themselves, the way that they've carried themselves to this point in their lives, no matter where that is, that they feel valid in that. And they 100% should, no matter what part of the journey you're on, But like I said, as friends, hold each other accountable to the standards that you set for themselves. And
I 100% agree. And I'd even take that just one step further and hold them accountable to the dreams, the aspirations that they have. But more importantly, hold them accountable to the personality traits, the essence of the importance of communication, the importance of understanding and assessing how you're feeling and being able to share that with others. These are just as important factors to hold them accountable to than the actual tangible things they want to achieve. And that never sacrifice, I think, the person that you want to be for the tasks and the achievements that you want to get. Because I think that's when you'll get into trouble. And that's when you see these unhealthy expectations, an inability to deal with failure when your character doesn't really match the dreams that you want to achieve. So hold them accountable, hold yourself accountable to the communication aspect as well, and grow emotionally as you grow, kind of physically and through the different tasks that you have to achieve.
well said. Very beautiful. I think we've talked about a lot today, and this has been something that has been bubbling since me and Richard started scripting. We have kind of been patiently waiting for this conversation. So I'm really glad to have had the chance to speak to you, Richard. And before we get to closing stuff, this is something that we haven't done on the show before, but I want to pose a question to the audience a little bit. And kind of as we go forward with the episodes in the future, a lot of them are going to be focused on specifically men's mental health. So this is the first question, and we're going to be collecting responses and whatnot. But you know, what is our role today as men for men in the future? And this is a very open-ended one. This is, you can kind of take this the way you want to, but we do have a role for the future. And whether this is from a man speaking on a man's perspective, or if you're not a man and you're observing how men are and want to have an idea of what men should be for the future of men, what is that role today? And this is a question I'm also going to extend to Richard.
I got put on the spot. Um, I was thinking the audience had this one. Um, I think number one is to not be rigid in defining that role and understanding that there has to be room for growth and development, um, as men continue to expand their view on the world, and as things continue to develop in society as well. But I think one area, and one role for men to go forward with is definitely the communication aspect and the idea that of creating more opportunities where you can share in a vulnerable space, um, and just having environments where that's okay, and that you don't have to be the put together most finished product competing for the highest job of all time. But there's times in your week where you maybe have a 30-minute chat of how you're feeling, how you're addressing maybe being overworked or maybe being um, challenged at work to do more. Those, while the first part of challenging yourself to be a better person at all times is very important, I still think it's very important for men to create an opportunity to debrief, understand their feelings, unpack what's going on in their life, um, And I think that in essence will allow men to go forward and then be better, like you said, leaders out in the world as well, once they're able to understand their own emotions a little bit better.
Beautiful. And as we're kind of wrapping up, Richard, it's been great having you here on the show. I think this was a very fruitful conversation, and I'm really hoping that you listening or whoever else listening, I hope that you took something away from everything that we talked about today, because it is important and it is something that for the sake of any sons that you may have or people may have in your life, and other men, young boys that you'll be encountering as you kind of go out, like, just keep in mind that it's been a difficult ride. It's a difficult ride for everyone. So maybe extend that kindness where you can, and help help in making people feel more valid about who they are, and maybe build a sandcastle or two, because I'm kind of craving one of those now. But as we're wrapping up, Richard, any closing statements? Anything you want the audience to kind of be left with?
I think I'm just going to build off exactly what you just said, and that's a great place with it, is that validating others doesn't mean that it invalidates you. The more validation and the more appreciation you can provide out into the world, whether that be from men to other men, or men to all others in society, and between everyone else in society, and each other as well. I think it's not a zero sum game of that if you provide it out, you will be invalidating yourself, and understand that there's always an opportunity to empower someone, to give someone an opportunity to speak, to allow someone to be heard. Um, and keep that in mind, that those opportunities can happen more often than they do right now.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Richard, so much for being on the show. It has been a pleasure. And, hopefully we can have you on again sometime in the future. Who knows? But without further ado, thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to talking to you again soon. Take care.